Good afternoon or good morning to those in Hawaii and Alaska. This is Rodney Sobin with NASEO. Welcome to the webinar, but we're going to hold off just for a minute as people are still calling and logging in, and we'll start in just a minute or so. So thank you. I see people are still logging in, so I'll give it another half a minute or so, and please stand by. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, good morning to those who are in the Pacific, in Alaska and Hawaii, and places further west. Welcome to today's webinar, which is being offered under the aegis of the NASEO-NARUC GEB Working Group, where GEB stands for Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings. I'll tell you a little more about the working group in a few minutes. We're very fortunate to have 3 speakers today that will focus on tools and approaches to measure and manage emissions associated with demand flexibility and grid interactive efficient buildings, how we can use demand flexibility to manage and reduce emissions. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge my NASEO colleague Ed Carley, who is behind the scenes working on organizing this as well. I'll introduce speakers in a few minutes, but first some housekeeping. Next slide, please. So this webinar, like all NASEO webinars, will be recorded. The webinar recording and slides will be posted via the NASEO website. There's the thing there that shows you where. It will also be on the Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings web pages that we run for the working group. All attendees are muted. Please use the GoToWebinar question box to ask questions. There are quite a few people on this webinar, so we will keep people unmuted. There is also a raise hand function. If you feel you'd like to use that, please feel free to do so. But the question box should probably be the primary means of asking questions. And the Q&A period will be after the presentations are done to ensure that all the speakers have adequate time. Next slide, please. I do want to take a moment to talk about the NASEO-NARUC GEB Working Group. I think, as we all know, the advancing technologies are building up opportunities for flexible management of demand, which can reduce costs, enhance resilience. And today we'll be focusing on load management as a tool for reducing emissions. There are various economic, environmental, and operational benefits of managing loads in this way. Main questions that states have include how can we optimize facility interactions with the grid? How can states fashion policies, programs, and regulations to advance optimization through grid interactive efficient buildings? And what are roles for states, facility operators, utilities, service providers, product providers, and others to make this happen? We're very pleased to be collaborating and partnering with our colleagues at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners to form the NASEO-NARUC State GEB Working Group. And we're very grateful for support from the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office, as well as collaboration with the DOE National Labs, who are supporting technical assistance being offered to the working group. Next slide, please. I won't read the names of all the states on the working group. You can see them there. We are very fortunate to have two co-chairs, Casey Radcliffe of the Oregon Department of Energy and Hannah Terwilliger of the Minnesota PUC staff. The 17 states in the group are working on informing each other and getting educated on grid interactive efficient buildings, considering policy and regulatory mechanisms, and as I mentioned, working with the national labs on technical assistance. So, okay, now about the speakers. We have 3 speakers today, starting with Colby Tucker. Colby is a senior policy analyst at EPA in the Climate Protection Partnership Division of the Office of Air and Radiation. His work focuses on supporting state, local, and tribal governments' needs in evaluating energy policy in an emissions context. He is the program manager for EPA's AVERT tool, which you will hear quite a bit about today, and has been with EPA for 5 years. He will be followed by Henry Richardson. Henry is an analyst with WattTime. He works with WattTime's partners and collaborators and helps them to understand how they can affect the energy grid and achieve the greatest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, whether through location-based renewable siting or automated emissions reductions, which you will hear quite a bit today. Henry specializes in building performance, including emissions-focused load shifting, energy storage integration, and methods for assessing overall building emissions. Batting last, either third or cleanup if you count me as the first speaker, Nancy Seidman, who is Senior Advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project. She has more than 35 years experience in the energy and environmental policy arenas, where she's worked on advising policymakers, advocates, and utility sector participants at the intersection of environmental and energy policy. Her work is focused on air quality and climate change policies, the benefits of energy efficiency, beneficial electrification, including transportation as well. She has worked at the state, regional, and federal level on environmental policy, regulations, and program implementation. Let's move on to Colby's presentation, please. And take it away.
Thanks very much, Rod, and thank you, Ed, for driving. Very good. So I will be talking about AVERT today and how it can be used in determining hourly marginal emission rates.
Just a moment, please. We don't see the presentation up yet.
Oh, very well.
It says waiting to view Colby's screen. Okay, we see it.
All right.
There you go. Go ahead.
Perfect. Excellent. Take 2. So thanks very much for the introduction, Rod. I'll be talking to you about AVERT today. And so to give a little bit of context about AVERT and the topics that we will discuss today, I'll give a little bit of an overview of the electric sector, talk about emissions from the electric sector, and then some key topics that relate to GEBs, which is marginality, curtailment, and then we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into AVERT with a quick demonstration. So I'm sure most of the speakers or most of the attendees of today's meeting is quite familiar with the construction of the electric sector, but just to get oriented, we can think about the electric sector in terms of generation, transmission, distribution, and our end users, and how the electricity is demanded from our end users and created from our generators and transmitted through our system. The construction of the different sales by sector, we're probably talking about 75% of all the electricity sales today. When we talk about GEBs, we're thinking about our residential sectors and our commercial sectors, and depending upon the programs that you're really focusing on, you may be in one bucket or the other. But just for context, we could be addressing about 75% of all of our electricity sales with respect to GEBs. And then in total numbers, in 2018, we've had about 3.8 3,800 terawatt hours of electricity sold. So quite a bit of electricity to be dealing with. May have hit it twice here. So the electricity sector answers that generator to end user through complex markets. And so we have wholesale energy markets that are oriented in various different ways throughout the United States. And these circles that you see are the balancing authorities that clear those markets. And so end users will demand electricity. Balancing authorities will see that demand and answer it through generators. And that dance between generators and end users is solved by these balancing authorities. And so they have a great deal of control around how electricity moves throughout our grid. And they're subject to various different regulations from FERC to maintain grid reliability and so forth. But I won't be getting into that today. And real reason why we're talking about today is in terms of emissions. And to understand the emissions, we should understand who is producing our electricity. And so this is just a quick graph of electricity over time. You can see that coal is decreasing over time. Again, no surprises. I think to this audience, and natural gas of late has been increasing, and our green bars for renewable generation is also increasing. And you can see the black line there, which are our total emissions, which have peaked around 2006, 2007, and have come down over time. And that is one of the topics of today's conversation, is how we can continue that trend. Next slide. Very good. I'm going to use these arrows here. And then just to take a deep dive into more recent data, here we have 2018 data looking at the generation by type. And what I'm trying to show here is another representation of how renewables and fossils stack up, and also with nuclear in terms of percentages. And you can see that wind and solar are becoming more appreciable percentages here, which is the green story of understanding how our grid is slowly becoming cleaner, and how we can even get it more cleaner through grid efficient buildings. And so with that in mind, we can look at how emissions specifically have been changing over time. As that grid has changed, we can see steep declines in SO2 and NOx, and we can also see declines in greenhouse gas, CO2. This is in large part because of the changing nature of the grid, but also because of various different regulations on power plant emissions. And so there's steep declines again in SO2 and NOx, and there's still more work to be done in terms of CO2 here. So this is a little bit of a cartoon of understanding how this plays out on a day-to-day basis. You can see how you have different generators coming on at different times of the day as we go from midnight to midnight. And you can see the red line here, which is the demand from the grid. And you can see this may be a typical day if you're, say, a summertime in New England, where at 2, 3, 4 p.m., you're getting peak demand, and that's being answered by generators coming on. These would be probably gas generators if you're talking about New England, but you're also getting some solar that's generating as well. And so this grid mix really tells us how emissions are being determined across the course of the day, and then as these change over the course of the year, emissions will also change depending upon this grid makeup. And so understanding how we calculate these emissions is a key point for today. And so when we talk about emissions rates, we can be talking about average emission rates, and we can be talking about marginal emission rates. If you think about average emission rates on the left, this is for any megawatt hour, what is the CO2 that is being generated, or the SO2 that's being generated. And so this is the average across all the different generators that are producing at any given time. On the right, you can take a look at the marginal generators, which is as demand is increasing, what is the next generator coming online emitting? And because of that demand, that marginal generation and those marginal emissions is a different value than what the average emissions are. And so as we think about load shifting, and as we think about energy efficiency or renewable energy added to the grid, that change in the grid is targeting these marginal emissions, which again, I'm emphasizing is a little bit different from our average emissions. And in fact, could be quite a bit different from the average emissions. And one other key concept here is that in certain cases, this is no longer a typical New England day. This might be a day from California where during the middle of the day, you may have solar generators exceeding demand. And so you'd have oversupply, in which case you'd have to curtail the solar power that's generated. Understanding how we can perhaps move that generation to different times would be able to solve some of the emissions from different hours. And so in this case, we would be thinking about increasing demand when that solar is generated. I want to emphasize that that's not necessarily true across different areas of the country, where you might have wind coming online at different hours that might be curtailed there, and solar coming online in different parts of the country that may cause for curtailment there. And so understanding where in the country curtailment is occurring and when is important for understanding how we might want to target rates and programs that can help move generation from one hour to the next. And I know other speakers today will talk more about that. So I want to take a dive into AVERT. And so AVERT is the tool that I manage, I help develop. And really what it seeks to do is quantify emissions changes from energy efficiency and renewable energy specifically. That was the impetus for creating AVERT, is this quantification question of, if we add energy efficiency to the grid, if we add renewable energy to the grid, what are the emissions that are being offset? Now, from this, we can also apply this to different contexts. AVERT could be used for understanding electrification in terms of heat pumps. AVERT could be used in terms of this question here with grid interactive buildings. Although I will say that we'll need to use more of manual functions to get to that question. But where AVERT lives in the spectrum of models is that we can think about it as an intermediate model. It has marginal hourly emission rates, which is perhaps a bit more advanced than another EPA product called eGrid, which has specific emission rates for the entire year, just has one value. But AVERT is a little bit more simplified compared to IPM or ProSim, which are very sophisticated capacity expansion models and economic models that take into account all sorts of different parameters and all sorts of different inputs that can help answer different questions and at different scales, different time scales and different spatial scales. The drawback for using those types of models is that they can be very expensive, they can be very, very time consuming, and because of their complexity, perhaps only a few people really know how to run them and can understand them. AVERT, on the other hand, is a little bit simplified than that. It's a free tool that EPA provides to the public, and it can be used by a broad audience based on its more simplified approach. And then as a quick side note, I do just want to have a quick pitch for another tool called Cobra, which translates these outputs from AVERT, these emission outputs, into health benefits. We understand that emission benefits often associated with health benefits, and this is a tool that can help understand that quantification question as well. If you have other questions about this, I'd be happy to answer them. So talking about how AVERT works, very briefly, it has 10 regions. This is for the lower 48 only. I'm getting a sign here that says we're experiencing difficulties with the audio. I just want to check in with the conference hosts.
I can hear you fine.
Great. So there's 10 regions around the country. These are based off of eGrid regions, as I mentioned previously, which allows these two models to speak with one another. AVERT is updated annually. You'll actually be going through an update very soon. And so I encourage you to reach back out in the next few weeks to get this latest update. We provide energy efficiency and renewable energy profiles. And so for users seeking to understand what those emissions impacts are, you can use EE and RE profiles that we have. And you know, the crux of AVERT is that it addresses this question of hourly marginal emissions. And we have both CO2 and criteria pollutants within the model. And the way that the model works is that it is a probabilistic prediction of how power plants are operating. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but so I will get to that to the next slide. And we also have a manual option with AVERT, which is where users can change the load profile 87, 60, however they want. And then I think this is really where we're talking about how we can dive into GEBs. And so let's take a look at how AVERT works here. And so AVERT takes data from other sections of EPA called the Air Markets Program. And this is a data set that seeks to understand how power plants are emitting. This is for all fossil-fired power plants, 25 megawatts and greater. And we take this data set and we put it through a statistical module that runs a Monte Carlo analysis to understand how power plants are operating for any given level of generation for the grid. And so as the grid increases in demand, power plants are operating slightly differently. And so as that grid demand is changing and as those generations are changing, power plants are operating differently. AVERT takes a probabilistic approach to solve that. And so we'll be working in what's called the main module here on the right side of the page. Most folks will be, if you use AVERT, we'll be using what's called these RDFs, the regional data files, in the square here in the main module. All right. So this is a screenshot of what the tool looks like. You can pick your region. For this particular example, I picked the Northeast, but you can see that you can just pick any of the 10 regions. The next step is to assign what are the impacts, what is the intervention from that base year that you want to apply. In this case, I've taken 500 gigawatt hours across the year. You can see it on the right-hand side here. There's this little blue line under negative 60 megawatts. And so for each hour of the year, we have reduced demand by roughly 60 megawatts. And so in this slide, this is what it would look like if you wanted to change each hour by hour on your own. And so I want you to remember this slide as we progress through data, because if you're thinking about grid efficient buildings, you might be switching hour to hour. And so you might, in hour one, be reducing demand, and then in hour 2, you'd be increasing demand, and you could test it through AVERT here to understand what the emissions impacts of that might be. I've just applied this total change here to understand how power plants are operating differently from our base year. So this is just the top line outputs. In this particular case, we're getting reductions across all of our pollutants. And you can see that these have emission rates here. And this is a top line result page. Now we're getting into the real meat of it here, which is these heat maps. And I'm sure folks are familiar with looking at heat maps. This to me is a really good visual representation of how the Northeast region is operating, how the marginal power plants are operating in the Northeast region. And so you can see over the course of the year how those power plants are changing across the different pollutants. And different pollutants can sort of correspond with different types of generators coming on and offline. So to highlight CO2, as you can see, in May through September, we have these large green swaths. That's relatively less intense carbon emitting power plants, and this would be from power plants that are lower emitting power plants, because the increased demand in those hours would be solved by non-emitting sources. So this would be from solar. You can also see that as you get more towards the middle of the day, where we have those real peaks in June, July, and August, this would be when demand is exceeding because of air conditioning likely, and so you have high-emitting peaking plants coming online to address that demand. And as you move across from left to right, you have a different representation of how these different pollutants are operating throughout the course of the year. One thing to note, just for distinction, is that if you look at CO2 and SO2 around May, June, July, you can see how you might be getting relatively more CO2 happening in the nighttime hours, but relatively more CO2 happening in the nighttime hours and relatively less SO2 occurring in the nighttime hours. And this is just, again, sort of call it a gut check of how these power plants are operating in whole across the year. Now, if we take a dive to where this arrow is, this is August, just to see what a week would look like. You can create a graph like this from AVERT that would say, as you go from midnight to midnight, and across the various different days of the week, Sunday to Saturday, you can see how in the middle of the day, say 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., you have these peak hours of carbon emitting power plants, which is then reduced in the nighttime hours. And so if there would be a way to understand how we could move those, we could quantify what the benefit from a carbon perspective that might be. What's interesting here is that you can see the weekends. Well, it's actually Thursday, Friday, Saturday, which is below the average line there. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in this case are above the average. But in all cases, except maybe Friday, Saturday, and this is the Friday before Labor Day, so folks may be taking it off and not in the office. But you can see from this data really rich results. Now, if we can also look at this in the NOx perspective. It follows a very similar trend. And again, you could quantify the difference if you had values saying in these hours, say 2, 3, 4, and you wanted to reduce those emissions by applying it to a different hour, you'd be able to quantify that here. SO2 is a little bit noisier. It in general follows the same trend. And I'll leave SO2 there, but you can have results for different pollutants in AVERT, which can be very helpful for an analyst. So the potential use cases that I can see with this are these and probably more. You can look at estimating emissions reductions from demand flexibility, insofar as you can apply these hours in the middle of the day, and then you can move them to the beginning of the day in this particular example, and you could then rerun the analysis in AVERT, and you can do that very quickly by going back to that manual screen and applying whatever value of generations you want to move from 1 hour to another to then get new results. And we can look at peak specifically. You can look at time of use rates, and we like to say that AVERT is good for a time year horizon of 5 years, and so you can have prospective evaluations, and then it's also very useful in retrospective analysis, saying if we had done this intervention, say in 2018 or 2017, what would the emissions benefits of that have been? So I'll leave it there. We have a website. You can contact me at my email address here, and I'd be welcome any questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Colby. As we're turning to Henry's slides, one clarifying question. In entering hourly manual, you don't mean literally manual that you have to type every hour by hour. Is there, I assume there's some means of importing from a spreadsheet or a data set the data for hour by hour into AVERT?
Yes, there's it's a spreadsheet in Excel, and so if you have another spreadsheet that has a profile, you can import it very easily. So you could do a manual analysis if you're going week to week, as the example that I used. But if you have your own profile, you can certainly copy and paste that into AVERT.
Thank you. Okay, Henry, your turn.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I really just want to say we are building on or complementing what Colby has just been through, because we really focus on bringing these capabilities into real time and controls. But briefly, before we get started, I'm with WattTime. We're a nonprofit that's really focused on what we like to say is giving people the power to choose clean energy. If you go to the next slide, and what we have there, what that really means is like time differentiating power to people and giving them the ability to understand when cleaner and dirtier times are on the grid. And so in this presentation on the next slide, we're going to touch on three things quickly. First, kind of what the platform is that we've created and how it works, and how it's intended for integration with controls. And then second, run through a quick case study of where this is kind of being implemented in a regulatory context. And then third, kind of say, what are the broader opportunities in buildings for load flexibility? How can we integrate these signals and actually respond to them at the building level? On the next slide, our kind of fundamental kind of key idea here is that those marginal emissions vary throughout the day, and consuming electricity at those different times has different impacts. So you want to be consuming more electricity at times when it's cleaner, and avoiding those peaks that may occur at various times. And so to do that, on the next slide, we take a bunch of grid information, including the AMPD database, that's redundant, and combine that with a bunch of historical data, real-time grid information, and kind of run that through our data models using an empirical or causal approach to identify what the marginal emissions are in real time, to create this kind of time varying signal of marginal emissions for the different balancing authorities and ISO subregions throughout the US and parts of the world, which creates a real-time signal that can be integrated into devices. On the next slide, just a quick example of where we're seeing this flexibility. So a significant portion of electrical end use in both residential and commercial is actually flexible. You don't really need your dishwasher to run the second you load it necessarily, but that load can be spread out throughout a night or different time periods. So automating that to take advantage of that is what we're focused on. You can see the same thing in compressor cycles, like on an AC system. You may need it to run for 30 minutes out of the full hour, but you can somewhat adjust the timing of that. And I think one of the key insights here is that people care about the environment. So even if they're not getting an economic signal, they may be motivated to shift load to reduce curtailment or prevent waste of renewables, or put less reliance on heavily polluting plants. And so people, consumers are excited about that. And so we're seeing interest and uptake in this. On the next slide, so to enable this load shifting, we've actually built a platform that takes all of this grid information and kind of combines it in a model that predicts what the real-time marginal emissions rates are. And then we take that and deliver that to various buildings, appliances, EVs, and we work with vendors and partners so that they can schedule that load on behalf of the consumers to those cleaner times, or to give customers that choice about, would you like to take advantage of this and shift your load to cleaner periods? I want to quickly touch on the next slide what the capabilities of this system are. So what we've done is built an API. The information on the left side is really focused on like the technical details. It's machine readable, can be integrated directly with devices, is secure, automatable, that type of thing. On the right side, I want to talk about what type of data is available. The kind of core is that real-time data that is delivered every 5 minutes of what the modeled emissions would be on the marginal emissions would be on the grid. So you have some information in real time about what the grid is doing. And then we also build a forecast out 24 hours of what we think the marginal emissions rate will be over the next day. And the essential thing there is to actually enable controls. That is the information that a controller in a building would, or in a device would need, like, relative to now, is it a good time or bad time to consume electricity in given hours? And so you can train algorithms to actually automatically shift load based on that. And then we do have historical emissions data, so you can train those models, historical emissions data and forecasts. So as you're building the algorithms to design the control system for a device, we have that historical data so that when you start using those forecasts in the real-time data, it can be integrated into the controls of a building intelligently. And so the actions that you would take have been tested and modeled. And we provide this data for all the ISOs and balancing authorities with 5-minute granularity typically. Some other grids balance on 15-minute or 30-minute frequencies, but we match that kind of ISO or balancing authority level data. Moving on to the kind of the case study, on the next slides, we're talking here about SGEP, which is the Self-Generation Incentive Program in California. And I bring this example up because it's kind of a mix of regulatory, buildings, and energy storage, because it's an interplay between all these forces. And on the next slide, there was an identification that energy storage was actually causing emissions. Everyone thinks of energy storage as a clean technology, but it's really only as clean as the energy that it's used to charge it. And so there were a bunch of academic papers and a couple news articles kind of explaining that storage systems are not necessarily charging at the most beneficial times from an emission standpoint. And that made the regulators in California take a closer look at the SGEP, which was incentivizing storage and providing significant incentives to install storage in both commercial and residential contexts. And one of their 2016 reports actually uncovered that the way that the storage systems were being dispatched were actually causing emissions increases. And so that was identified as an issue because the overarching goals of the program include emissions reduction as well as benefits to the grid, as well as incentivizing new technology. But emissions was a key component of that story. So on the next slide, I want to talk quickly about what the drivers were for this. One would think that round-trip efficiency could play a role in it, but that was not necessarily the most significant driver of why these storage systems were increasing emissions. They were also receiving, the financial signals they were receiving were not necessarily aligned with the needs of the grid. And so a lot of energy storage today is deployed for demand charge management in commercial buildings. And there's not necessarily a reason why the peaks in those buildings would align with grid emissions peaks. For example, in California, if you have midday curtailment in the spring, the building load demand might be highest in the middle of the day, but curtailment may be occurring at that period, and you'd actually want to be increasing load at that period and adding charging. And so the financial signal or the rate signal is really important, or the incentive signal is really important to determining how that storage system is operated or how that load flexibility is moved around. And so there was a mismatch between the program goals and the financial signals that the storage systems were receiving. On the next slide, I'm being a little glib here. This is a 3-year process, so the commission ruled that this should be solved, and then through a bunch of working groups and regulatory processes, the commission arrived at a decision saying that storage systems will be required to reduce emissions by this quantity per capacity. And that was intended to align the incentive with the overall intent. And it's intended to be a flexible framework, and I'll explain that quickly. But on the next slide, I want to explain how this reflects actual or changes actual operation. So this is a case study by NLX, where they were showing, okay, before this program came into place, we would just charge and discharge our storage in a way to control demand charges as effectively as possible. And then after the program, we're thinking about how do you achieve multiple outcomes, both emissions reductions and cost savings for the building. And so what they did is they actually co-optimized for cost and emissions, where they added a artificial carbon price to the carbon signal and layered them so that the storage system now takes into account emissions. And you can see the behavior change. Instead of charging in the evening peak, it's shifted to the middle of the night or midday when there's a low emissions period. And I think more insightfully on the next slide, they were able to see, even with a very small carbon price, by adding that into the optimizer so that it was aware of emissions, it actually inverted the emissions behavior of the storage system. And the carbon price is somewhat of an artificial construct. It's really just to make the system aware of emissions. There's no compensation directly linked to that price. The compensation is linked to the incentive structure. So now this storage system would receive the full incentive, whereas before it would have only received half. And this behavior is not uniform. On the next slide, you're actually looking at what that behavior looks like in every month. So before co-optimization, they were still achieving some emissions reductions in certain months, but that shifted the behavior after co-optimization, where it was taking advantage of those low emissions and curtailment periods to charge and then discharge during the peak and for cost purposes. There are still months where emissions increases occur, and that might just be because there's not a large enough emissions differential between the off-peak and the on-peak. And so what that results in on the next slide, this kind of co-optimization approach, is much more emissions aligned behavior, where that storage system is now charging as much as possible during the low emissions period and discharging during the high emissions period. That's kind of a very quick overview of like how a real-time emission signal can be built into a program, can be built into a structure and incentive so that multiple outcomes can be achieved. The commission essentially said, we are requiring that these storage systems achieve an emissions reduction. Here's the metric you'll be evaluated against. You can achieve that however you want. And then NLX was like, we think the most effective way of doing that is this co-optimization approach. And so all of the incentives became aligned with the outcomes of the project or the program. So I went quickly on the next slides, want to look at what does that actually mean for a building. So this is very much so energy storage focused. Could you quickly advance 2 slides? Thank you. So what does automated emissions reduction, what we're calling this, look like in a building beyond energy storage? So we're partnering with various partners to bring emissions controls to electricity storage as well as thermal storage, because you can charge your heating or cooling with an electric with a chiller, let's say, on off-peak periods. Microgrids are often connected to many systems, including EV chargers, lighting, HVAC systems, and can take this single signal and distribute it to various end uses. And for even more granular control in the BMS, you can see how an emission signal can be integrated into load management signals in the end use as well. And then finally, there are like non-commercial scale solutions, which include smart thermostats, smart EV chargers, kind of smart end use devices, which can also integrate the signal. We're also working on a study with the Center for the Built Environment at UC Berkeley saying what strategies in the building natively through controls can you actually take advantage of load flexibility. We've seen a lot of talk about what the benefits are, but we really want to understand, can you actually shift load? Can you take advantage of the thermal mass? Can you use set points within the comfort band where people won't notice that? Is there a ventilation strategy where you can kind of push and pull the ventilation? And then how much thermal lag do you have, let's say, in the chilled water system? Can you change the scheduling of the compressors so that you can take advantage of that as well? And what we've seen is that the timing and duration of these load flexibility strategies can be significant. So if one operates on a sub-hourly time scale, that's different than one that operates across a day. So the benefit and the impact is definitely scaled to the strategy. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to pull out a couple things from this that I think might be slightly buried. One of the key things is that you can get multiple outcomes out of a program. If you want to do peak load management in the grid as well as emissions reductions, you can figure out how to build your incentives to take advantage of that. As well as end users can co-optimize for multiple things, whether that's occupant comfort, as well as cost, as well as emissions. That is one of the things that we think that systems are capable of. And then understanding how rates and incentives have flexibility already built into them is essential. For example, time of use rates. Since they're so blocky, they don't necessarily indicate the variation within those windows. So if you have a window that runs from 6 p.m. or 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. the next day, that's a 12-hour window where there may be emissions variation. And if you add an incentive or some way of indicating the variation within that window, devices and load flexibility can take advantage of that. And then finally, we see that making sure that the incentives are aligned with the actual outcome. If you incentivize like charging and discharging cycles, which SGEP initially did, the storage systems ensured they hit that target and weren't looking at emissions. So ensuring that the incentives are aligned with that outcome is essential. And I think Nancy may build on this, so I would love to hand it to her.
Thank you very much, Henry. Let's hand it to Nancy then. You're on.
All right, great. I can start, and hopefully my slides will be up shortly. Great, there we go. Title slide. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to NASEO, Rodney, and Ed for offering this webinar on this critical issue, and to Colby and Henry for their presentations. As Rodney noted, my name is Nancy Seidman. I'm a senior advisor with the Regulatory Assistance Project. Next slide, please. So here's the outline of my presentation. I'd like to build on Colby and Henry's presentations with the following. We've heard that the emissions impacts of integrated buildings, including distributed energy resource, including flexible loads like buildings, varies with time and based on marginal emissions on the grid. And this is relevant for all air pollutants, the criteria pollutants, toxic pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions. Usually building owners will manage their resources to minimize their costs, but you've seen today 2 tools to help building owners minimize their emissions as well. And in your roles as state energy or air quality or utility commissions, you can help building owners make the choice to minimize cost and emissions. You can make it easier to do while helping meet your state's energy and environmental goals. Next slide, please. So ultimately, any question about the value of electricity service must consider value to whom. I like this statement because it can be used to talk about many aspects of electricity. For our purposes, frequently the idea of minimizing environmental or emissions impacts is not explicitly considered part of the value of electricity. It's recognized as important, but it's been difficult to quantify or analyze. And the good news is that that's changing, and our programs need to change with it. Next slide, please. So I want to emphasize a few points made by Colby and Henry. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why do emissions matter? Obviously, energy use produces emissions, criteria pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, and toxics that harm our health. There's been renewed interest in the health impacts of air pollution. For example, given recent Harvard research showing that there's a link between fine particles that are emitted through fuel combustion, the COVID virus, and mortality. Harvard has found that an increase in 1 microgram per cubic meter of fine particles is associated with an 8% increase in the COVID-19 death rate. And for those who don't work in air quality every day, a 1 microgram variation in particulate matter is common. The annual standard is 12, and the 24-hour standard is 35. Among the many tragedies of the COVID pandemic, this is one where I feel we can affect the impact of the virus. Next, please. We want to minimize, We want to minimize all emissions, and we want to account for their true costs in the cost of producing and consuming power. Next slide, please. So how does this translate into action? The grid is changing rapidly, as Colby demonstrated, due to changes in demand and fuel mix and to improvements in electricity generating technologies. And this slide shows how the time of day and the amount of renewables on the grid influences when one might want to charge an electric vehicle, a water heater, or use electricity in a building. You can see California and Texas on this slide since their amount of renewables is large. What we're illustrating here is the differences in California and Texas between the time when emissions are low in green and high in red, which would be it's green in California at 1 p.m. for their low emissions given their solar output, and at 11 p.m. in Texas for their low emissions given their wind resources. So obviously when you charge a car or a building, use electricity in building, that affects what's emitted. In other words, knowing the fuel that's used at different times of day to power devices like heat pumps and electric vehicles, in other words, knowing the generation source, is crucial for determining the overall emissions impacts of building electrification. And then that means that helps us design policies and programs that can reduce costs as well as emissions. Next, please. So Colby and Henry demonstrated 2 ways to track and learn more about marginal emissions. And here's another way to illustrate the state of play in one large system operator in the Mid-Atlantic and the Midwest, or PJM. I'm using nitrogen oxides here for illustration. This source document that's listed there has carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. And importantly, a page about the standard deviation of these figures, which is sometimes above 1. And for those of you who don't usually work in standard deviations, a deviation of 1 means that if the number you're looking at is a 1, it means the true value could range from 0 to 2. In other words, we don't have a lot of confidence in these numbers. So the question is, what information is most helpful to designing programs to ensure that efforts like increasing electric vehicles, using battery storage, and how they can assist with state plans to meet the federal air quality health standards or climate plans? What information do you need? And it would be more than what's on this slide, which is what's available in PJM. I'll talk about data needs in a minute. But to me, this is not sufficient information given the variability and the lack of resolution. For example, note the variation between the relatively flat but decreasing system average in red and the on-peak marginal rate that's in blue. That leads me to want to ask a lot of questions about this graph. Next, please. So you know that peak periods lead to higher costs to consumers. This slide shows the variation in generation to meet average demand and peak demand across a year, which is a factor of almost 2 at its highest point, and it illustrates what we mean by peak reductions in the upper right corner. So times of peak use and generation generally lead to highest emissions, but in most places we don't know that without matching emissions to grid information. There may be places where off-peak times lead to higher use of coal, or given transmission constraints of renewable energy, it can't get to where it could serve load and fossil generation is needed instead. Colby talked a little bit about curtailment data. Both of the situations I just mentioned can lead to higher emissions when you wouldn't expect it. So this is another reason to have better emissions data tied to generation, as AVERT and WattTime are designed to do, as well as getting that information for programs in your states that are designed to reduce demand at any time and at peak times. Next slide, please. So if you can run AVERT to understand your grid better, that's great in helping you understand how, what, and when your grid is changing and the range of emissions values and how your annual, seasonal, and hourly emissions vary. If you work with WattTime, that's great too for ongoing detailed information and the ability to fine-tune things like demand response programs and the other examples that Henry mentioned. To me, the most important information is to know what's going on at peak times and in peak seasons. Is that summer and winter? And what fuels determine the marginal emission rate? And how often is that fuel on the margin? For example, if you think back to the PJM slide, how often is the marginal rate, the marginal value 2 to 4 times the average? How many hours? How many days? Is that seasonal? I think working with your system operator is important to get the information you need, and I'd be happy to work with any state who's interested in doing that, and so please be in touch. Next slide, please. So what can we do? How do we develop strategies for buildings and other loads that are flexible, and what are some of the programs that can help? Next slide, please. First principles always, put efficiency first. Efficiency reduces demand and reduces all pollutants without 1 kilowatt hour being used. You can help raise the profile of the impact of emissions in your energy efficiency programs by noting that all reduction in demand from energy efficiency programs lowers emissions. And obviously that's important for climate goals and for any air pollution problem. And we all know that efficient buildings have many benefits. They use less energy. They retain their temperature longer through thermal storage, whether it's hot or cold. And therefore they're more resilient and they provide resiliency benefits to their community. In another area, your energy efficiency program evaluation could acknowledge that efficiency measures that reduce peak demand is valuable for reducing emissions and costs and work to get the data to show that. Next, please. Second, you can recognize the value of flexible load. For 100+ years, we've been managing supply to meet load. Now we can schedule load to meet supply. The key here, like I showed in the California and Texas slide, is to take advantage of the ability to shift load, whether it is in buildings, electric vehicles, and water heaters to lower emissions, as well as lowering the cost. Here, we're moving peak afternoon demand to a period where there's surplus solar and moving the AM peak to earlier in the morning when wind power is available. Next. Many have heard of Lawrence Berkeley National Labs papers on using distributed energy resources, and they coined this phrase about shape, shift, shimmy, and shed load. So I thought that was important. I wanted to include a graphic about that and a link to their paper. So this illustrates the various ways loads can be adapted to meet demand. You can shape the overall profile of demand over 24 hours through things like efficiency. You can shift to other times when renewable energy is available, as I was just talking about. You can shed the load if it's necessary during peak times, or you can shimmy that load in a shorter term way. It's sort of like a shorter term shed in a way that people don't notice. For example, it's when the utility controls your air conditioning and it's cycling on and off and over short periods of time so you don't notice it in your office or your house. There are also 3 papers by Rapp at the end that discuss these concepts within electrification. So your role can be to have utility distributed resource programs recognize and account for the environmental benefits along with grid systems benefits. Next. slide, please. Third, this principle on rate design shows that we want to align the choices customers make, next click please, with the choices that work best to minimize overall costs. That's easier said than done, but it's worth aiming for. Good rate design can align what's good for grid integrated buildings with what's good for the entire electric system as well as society. It helps consumers lower their costs along with lowering the system's cost. If the price is right, consumers change their behaviors. We see this all the time in many different industries and in providing services and goods. And the way you all regulate utilities can determine whether grid integrated buildings operate for just their own use or also for public benefit. In other words, good state or local or federal program design can maximize environmental benefits if the cost-benefit analysis for the programs, like grid integrated buildings, uses information on a grid's emissions profile. Rate design can help align our incentives with an outcome that's good for others. So maybe we can discuss rate design more in questions and answers because it's an area well worth exploring further. Next slide, please. In the broadest sense, here's a huge opportunity for you and your agency. In designing and evaluating programs, state or local officials or federal officials working with your colleagues across agencies can use your cost-benefit calculations and energy efficiency programs and distributed energy resource programs and rate design to design programs and policies that include the environmental impacts using tools like we've seen today. By considering the air pollution impacts of these programs, you'll be looking at a wider sense of value to whom, making it broader. And if we include the time-varying impacts of emissions in cost-benefit calculations, then the programs improve that much more. These tools and others allow you to do that. You have the power to do this. Next slide, please. And in conclusion, my next slide. The emissions impacts of all distributed resources, including flexible loads like buildings, vary with time and seasons, and knowing their marginal emission rates on the grid is key. Low cost and low emissions hours may differ. Usually, building managers or building owners manage resources to minimize costs, but what you've seen today are tools to minimize emissions too. AVERT and WattTime allow a building owner to manage their emissions along with their costs more easily. Good program design for efficiency, for rates, for encouraging grid flexibilities are within your purview and can be used to maximize environmental benefits. The folks from NASEO, the folks from NARUC, the folks from NACA can all help building owners make this easier to do and assist you and society in meeting your state's energy and environmental goals. Next, please. With that, here's a couple of resources that I hope will be helpful to you. There's a couple on beneficial electrification. There's one on emissions, valuing emissions, one on rate design, one on distributed energy resources. And with that, next slide, my last slide. There's my contact information, and I thank you all very much, and I look forward to our question and answer period.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was great, and Colby and Henry's as well. And I would like to remind folks to use the question box to offer questions and maybe some comments as well. And we do have a question, actually sort of two questions in one from David Nemsow. So I think this is kind of a general question for anyone, although the second portion may be more for Colby. And question one is really about when you have congested transmission and distribution at peak times, there's a lot of line loss, or I squared R, if you want to get Ohm's law about it. So the question is, can some of those losses in the T&D system also be quantified? And in the context of this webinar, could the emissions impacts of those be included as well? The second part is about projected changes in the future of the fleet and generation mix, including retirements of existing fossil units, heat rate improvements, renewables growth. So I guess the first part, I'll open it up to anyone to talk about transmission distribution losses. Are those included in the AVERT and WattTime tools in some manner? And the second, probably more for Colby, the question about projecting future changes in the fleet mix, and maybe you can say a word about updates to the AVERT model and enhancements to the model. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm happy to take the second part first, unless Henry, you want to take a stab at the beginning.
I can quickly touch on the beginning. Congestion is definitely a very interesting question. And I think there are two parts that are interesting here. The first is if there is congestion, that also means that the marginal generator may vary by region. So as congestion increases, that will isolate parts of the grid because the unit that's responding will have to be within that subregion. So that is one aspect of it. And then in addition to that, you also have increased line losses. We have kind of a rudimentary approach currently, but we're always improving our ability to detect situations about increased line loss and increasingly get granular results, because all of CAISO may not be uniform if there's congestion on path 15, or the eastern and western parts of PJM are not perfectly linked, and there's a clear place where those emissions rates may diverge, linked to both congestion and line loss. I hope that's a brief stab at that. If there are further questions, we can definitely answer those. And then Colby, do you want to answer the second?
Sure. I don't have much more to add on the line loss, other than AVERT does take into account standard T&D losses annually, but there's no dynamic line loss factor that gets incorporated into AVERT. In terms of forward-looking fleet changes, AVERT does not have any sort of capacity expansion or fleet changing base data in it. It does not have the ability to look past 5 years, but we have an ability for users to modify the grid fleet should they want to on their own. If you remember the slide that I showed that had the boxes and arrows, another function within the tool that a user can modify the fleet if they choose, but we currently do not have defaults on what that future grid might look like.
Thank you. So Colby, I'll maybe follow up. So that suggests that AVERT can be a tool that air quality managers, energy offices, PSCs can use to project potential future emissions based on planned or supposed retirements and new construction and those sorts of things. They can make those sorts of adjustments and project in the short term, not beyond the 5 years.
So in either case, you can make changes to the base data in AVERT, where you could retire certain plants, or if you knew of certain new generators coming online, you could add them to the data. What that would effectually do is that you would then have new generators to then be impacted on whatever intervention you then choose. And so you would have different marginal factors being affected based on whatever that base data is. And so if you're changing the base data that then would get affected by your intervention, then you're going to get different, marginal factors, of course. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So another question for Henry. So with your tool, with the WattTime platform, who is actually sending signals to the customer? Is it WattTime? Is it the utility? Is it an aggregation provider of some sort, or an RTO? Who's sending the signal? And I guess a related question is, who is sort of your customer? What's your business model? You must make a buck off of it, even though you're a nonprofit.
Yes, that's a very good question. What we found is that the raw information itself is not very useful to end consumers. Knowing the emissions intensity of the grid doesn't tell me anything. So what we've been doing is we've been partnering with utility programs, incentive programs, device vendors, aggregators, and so anyone that delivers devices or signals to consumers to add a choice into that device. So do you want to run it in a green way, yes or no, and what that impact will be. So we aggregate the information from the grid, process that to identify, to model the marginal emissions, and then deliver that directly to vendors or devices or partners, whether those are utilities, so that they can be integrated into the control system. And we're a nonprofit, so we receive some grant funding, but we also charge a small subscription fee so that we can maintain and improve our models for detecting emissions and the infrastructure. I think does that cover the range of where we fit into programs?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, and it does sound like it's flexible. So it may be the EE program or DR program administrator, it may be some other entity. It depends on the business relationship and how the grid is organized, I suppose.
Exactly, and I want to make another point that I don't know that I made before, but we have worked with some DR partners, and we've really shifted the mindset from event-based, 10 or 12 events per year per summer, towards a more continuous optimization where that device every 5 minutes is making a new decision, which has both grid benefits as well as emissions benefits and consumer benefits. And so that's a different approach or a different mindset than traditional DR.
Okay, great. Another question, I think more for Nancy, maybe to provide some sort of illustration of flexible loads. And I know in a previous version of your presentation, a draft, you had talked about EVs and water heaters. I wonder if that's something you might explicate on for the audience.
Yes, actually, if Ed could go back to my slides and pull up 22, and that would be great. Thank you for asking me that, because I think it's I think a lot of people like to think that electric vehicles are special, and they are, of course. But we like to talk about how EVs are a lot like water heaters. So if you click to the next slide, and then keep going, please, to the next slide. Okay, so the way we like to talk about this is if you look at their demand in terms of what they pull from the grid, they're pretty similar, somewhere between 3 and 6 or 7 kilowatts. They both can be charged to and use about 2,000 to 4,000 kilowatt hours per year. So you can charge them, so you can avoid charging them. You can set them up with timers or whatever. So work through your utility program so you can avoid charging during morning and early evening hours and avoid the peaks. And lastly, I think if you click once more, Ed, you can see that they both tend to carry a full day's supply. You can run around in your EV unless you're commuting. I can't imagine you'd be commuting more than 100 miles. Maybe you are 100 miles a day. But the same thing with a water heater, depending on how many people in your house. Usually, if you charge it, it'll go close to 24 hours before you would need to charge it again. So I think, Rod, and for everybody else, what this demonstrates is we've got a lot of flexible load out in the world. If you're water heaters and you're sitting in the grid integrated buildings, that you could use to avoid charging during peak times and similars. I think people think about that for electric vehicles, but we don't always think about it for water heaters.
Okay, great. Here is a very challenging question. Any of you can take a whack at it, but I suspect Henry may be in the better position based on the experience of WattTime. This question is, what are the top 3 most aggressive policies or programs today that are supporting demand flexibility and in parentheses GEB, grid interactive efficient buildings. And where is that happening? So I'll give, that's not an easy one, but I don't know. Henry, you want to give it a shot?
That is a very good question. Nancy might have some input, but I feel like SGIP, Self-Generation Incentive Program in California, is very aggressive. We're seeing some very interesting things in Minnesota as well for EV charging. There's another building one that's on the tip of my tongue that I can't place. Nancy, do you have any thoughts here?
Well, I was gonna mention Minnesota, so I was glad you did. Maryland might be another. They're doing a lot of interesting things with performance-based regulation. So is Michigan, actually. That's not directly to grid integrated buildings. I think a lot of this is happening at the city level as well. Cities who are interested in have their climate goals, some of the C40 cities, and see their buildings as a way to the need to bring building electrification into their planning to get the reductions that they need to meet their climate goals. So I'm thinking New York, I guess some of the California cities. Henry, you may know, back to you maybe on that. Some of the larger Austin, places like that.
I think a lot of the cities haven't quite arrived at the load flexibility component of it. They're really thinking about efficiency and fuel switching at this point. So I think that's probably their next step from what I've seen. But
yeah, but I'm thinking about cities where the building codes may be building in things that require monitoring, you know, the systems, Henry, that you would tap into to help them align the emissions with their policies for electrification.
Absolutely, and I think New York City would be a good example of that, where they did monitoring before and are thinking about controls now.
Right.
We didn't mention the DOE or GSA, but they're scrutinizing this, I think, in great detail and are addressing it on multiple fronts, which is exciting.
Okay, great. And I'll interject a couple of thoughts about that. On the local buildings, I think that's an area of interest, but it's sort of nascent, and there is a toe in the door in the New York City's building performance standard, but they ain't there yet. But I think they're looking in that direction to be more reflective of time differentiation. I would also add that there are a number of places where there are battery programs. Some of the utilities in New England, I'm thinking of Massachusetts, Vermont, and I think there's one of the New Hampshire utilities have integrated some battery programs in residential. There are some developments. I know the firm Sonnen is involved. There may be others who have been using batteries for load shifting and modulation. There's a residential development in Utah, another one in Arizona. So some of these are popping up. Are they full-fledged demand flexibility GEB, or most of the way there, or part of the way there? I look at the issue as sort of a continuum from old-fashioned demand response to real dynamic demand flexibility, and there's that continuum along there. So I hope that's responsive, and I invite the asker to offer her thoughts on that as well offline. Let's see, here's another one that just arrived. I'm just reading it aloud, so I'm not sure I grasp it quite yet. Do you think Carter era, for those of us old enough to remember Jimmy Carter, appliance rebate programs should be modernized to reward appliances and equipment that can communicate versus just being efficient from the cold start? Any comment on Washington, Oregon, California, looking at CTA 2045 standards for water tanks? So I think the issue here is grid interactive, grid responsive appliances. In this case, it's particularly water heaters. Any comments on that from our speakers? Should appliance rebate programs, and for that matter, appliance standards or Energy Star certification include load flexibility in end-use appliances?
Well, I'm not up on the specific standard that they're asking about, but one of the reasons I wanted to mention the water heaters and the electric vehicles is because of the huge untapped potential that we have in water heaters. There's also been programs in some areas where instead of encouraging people to replace their water heaters through an energy efficiency program, the utility's actually leasing them, and with the lease comes the requirement that you allow the utility to control them. And obviously you get paid to allow them to do that. And you also get a new water heater. So I just think there's a huge untapped potential for water heaters and the kinds of things we can do to encourage that. I'm for them.
Okay, great. Another one, this is for Colby. So actually there are a couple, but we'll do one at a time. So how would you model different types of resources like heat pumps in AVERT? Different resources, different technologies.
Sure. Well, currently in AVERT, we have a few different standard resources to model. These are solar, wind, some energy efficiency portfolios. I should note that we will also be adding offshore wind shortly. And so in the next edition, you should be on the lookout for that. For something like heat pumps, we currently don't have a load profile in AVERT. I am aware that folks maybe at DOE or NREL might be developing or have developed energy profiles for heat pumps. And if you are able to find them, or if you feel comfortable creating your own and testing it, then it would be the same sort of manual functionality where you would put that into AVERT and then understand what the additional load from those heat pumps might be. And so that's unfortunately wouldn't get at any of the emissions reductions of switching fuels, but you would be able to understand what the impact from the electricity sector would be if you add heat pumps.
Okay,
and if you
great.
have your own load profile.
So the other question for you, so the other question for you is there a way to model states that are that are in more than one AVERT region or smaller regions? So I guess this gets to some of the opportunities, but also maybe some of the limitations of the AVERT's geographic granularity.
Yeah. So currently we have 10 regions in AVERT. In future editions, we will have 14 regions in AVERT, and so you can keep your eye out again for the next edition of the tool. And so our spatial resolution will slightly increase, although it certainly will not get to the 50 state regions, unfortunately. Unfortunately, our grid does not neatly align with our state borders. So there are some spatial limitations in AVERT in terms of how you're doing your modeling. And I think that is simply because of the nature of the grid and its complexity, and not necessarily having true islands in where your electricity is being generated from and where it's being sent to. That being said, we do our best to make AVERT as granular as it can be, while we still feel like the integrity of the model and the statistics are fruitful in terms of its results. For states that exist, let's say you're in Illinois, and so part of the state might be in ComEd, and then so that could be in PJM, and then the rest of the state is in say MISO, I believe. You'd be caught between two different AVERT regions, and so you would have to do some apportionment between the two regions and run two separate analyses. This is another improvement that we hope to be making in the next update to expedite that particular analysis.
Great, thanks. That's very good. This may be for, I guess, any of you, but I guess especially for Henry and Colby regarding your tools. Can these tools be used to consider emissions impacts of exporting on-site generation to the grid? And you know, that could be clean PV, but it could also be you know, natural gas or biogas or something else as well. So, you know, I think the tools are mainly oriented towards reducing consumption from the grid, but is there a way to calculate or model exports to the grid from these distributed resources?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. In short, the answer is yes. It would treat the model would be treating whatever is exporting on site in the same sort of way as reducing total demand in whatever region that you're in. I'm sort of thinking through this out loud. You may need to include your own factor for incorporating T&D losses, whether that's a penalty to what gets exported, or maybe it would be beneficial, probably a penalty. But yes, if you have, again, a profile of what you're producing on site and exporting to the grid, you'd be able to have an understanding of what the total grid impacts of that would be.
Okay, great.
I completely agree. The only thing I would add would be that you could even theoretically determine whether it's better to run a natural gas on site or take grid from the electricity. Like if you had a cogen plant that was running in electricity generation mode, or you could start to like trade off decisions on types of generation on site as well.
Interesting. Okay. For Nancy, you are a former air quality regulator, and you participated in some discussions some time back with colleagues from our NASEO community and the NARUC communities. Do you see these tools as being useful for sort of bridging the missions of air quality, utility commissions, state energy offices in developing plans and policies and regulations? Could you see this as maybe, you know, running things through AVERT and WattTime and getting experience with them, you know, helping move the policy front along?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think anything we can do to sort of help the different agencies and their different roles sort of appreciate what each other's goals are and try to align them and align the incentives that go that are seen in the public, whether that's environmental regulators understanding a little bit more about rate design, whether it's the utility regulators understanding how the peak times, getting data like from AVERT, looking at data from things like AVERT and WattTime and saying, oh wow, I didn't realize that the costs, you know, we've got some real problems with emissions here. The energy offices and how they deploy incentives, how they might work on with the efficiency programs and with the utility commissions, and understand how those programs, especially states who are looking at electrification, how considering the emissions impacts of those programs, as both Colby and Henry showed in some of their examples. There's some real opportunities here to align the goals with the right information, more information than we've had in the past, and set up the programs with different incentives that mean that we get reduced costs and reduced emissions. We're not working at cross purposes to each other.
Okay, great. Henry, do you and Colby, do you have any comment on that topic as well?
I think one piece that I think may have been touched on before, but I think is really important in this conversation around health impacts of different pollutants is the geography of where they occur, in my understanding, is very important. Unlike CO2, which is a universal pollutant, NOx and SOx and other criteria pollutants, when they occur in densely populated areas, have more health damages than in less populated areas. So understanding that differential adds another layer of complexity to that assessment. Nancy, is that a correct statement?
Yes, no, Henry, thank you very much for saying that. I can't believe I didn't say it myself. I really appreciate that. That's why I like to use examples from nitrogen oxides, because there are very different temporal, spatial, and seasonal impacts from NOx than there are from carbon dioxide. It's not that carbon dioxide isn't, it's very, very important, but looking at the criteria pollutants, as they're referred to, NOx and SOx and fine particles, and the public health standards that the air quality agencies have to meet under EPA requirements, have different considerations.
Okay.
The only thing I'll add is that
go ahead.
The only thing I'd add there is a quick plug again for the tool that my office develops called Cobra, which seeks to answer exactly that question. It quantifies the health impacts of these emission reductions, should they be emission reductions or emission increases, depending upon what your scenario might be. And so it's a similar to AVERT, free and easy tool that non-experts and analysts can use. Okay.
Well, we are at the end of our appointed hour and a half, which we've filled greatly. The presentations were really excellent, and the discussion afterwards was very, very good. So thank you all. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Ed, for your work on this as well. And also thank you to all our audience. And Ed, unless you see any hands up or any additional comments or questions, I think we're ready to sign off.
I don't see anything.
Okay. Well, thank you all and have a great rest of the day. We appreciate your participation. And also, if you do have inquiries about the GEB working group, please let Ed or I know, and we'd be glad to chat. Goodbye, everyone.